And greetings and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa. As always, we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. I'm George Mutalemwa, moderating this session. On behalf of the Africa Peace and Development Network, MAMA, our theme today is reclaiming the African imagination towards a decolonial memory of surplus. The speaker is Professor SimonMary Asese, Aihiokhai, who is a professor of theology and religious studies. He is also an affiliate faculty of ethnic studies at the University of Portland in Oregon, USA. Thank you so much, SimonMary, for the offer to speak to Global Peace. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Professor SimonMary Asese Aihiokhai.
Thank you very much, George. I see some people that I have not seen for many years, from some for over 25 years on the Zoom. So thank you for making time for this. It's early morning here where I am. It's 6 a.m. So if I'm not fully my vibrant self, you know I'm still sleepy. So I'm going to give a conceptual analysis of what I think is happening in Africa. So it's more of a constructive engagement, and so that's, I want that to be at the background of what I'm saying. So that said, in the work Madness, Language, Literature, the French philosopher Michel Foucault opens the first chapter with the following words, and I quote him: "We have known for some time that civilizations are defined not only by what they accept and welcome, and by what they value, but also, and perhaps especially, by what they reject and exclude." The African continent is a colonized one. Several European nations have planted their imperialistic flags on the continent and have proclaimed their intention to civilize the land and peoples of Africa according to their own European vision of civilization. If one is to take seriously the insight of Foucault, one must then ask the following question: what has been excluded by the European nations who colonized the African continent and people? Also, what did they accept from the realities defining the African people as they entered into the existential spaces and of Africans during the era of imperialism and colonialism? What does it mean to be African? And so these are very important questions. And here I'm trying to problematize even the concept Africa. So I'm intentionally using Africa to reflect the general experience of being a colonized people, even though that experience took place through different colonial agents. So as V.Y. Mudinde astutely notes, the colonists, those settling a region, as well as the colonialists, those exploiting a territory by dominating a local majority, have all tended to organize and transform non-European areas into fundamentally European constructs. Thus, three complementary hypotheses and actions emerge: the domination of physical space, the reformation of natives' minds, and the integration of local economic histories into the Western perspective, unquote. So even with what Mudinde has noted in this presentation, I speak with an intentionality of holding in place the differences that define Africa's vast socio-cultural worlds. When I use the term Africa, I am intentional at focusing on the colonial realities defining the continent. In no way do I want to trivialize whatever effort may have been made by some parts of the continent to address their own colonial realities. And here I'm particularly conscious of the effort of Tanzania under the late Julius Nyerere. In my own opinion, I am convinced that he seems to have been the only post-colonial African leader that took seriously colonial trauma and decided to address that in the form of nation building. That said, before a decolonial term can be enacted, one has to take seriously what the late Cameroonian Jesuit Engelbert Humperdinck observed about Africa's collective post-colonial existence. The crisis of what he termed anthropological poverty defines post-colonial African psyche. This crisis refers to the fracture of memory that defines contemporary African sense of self. In other words, the African psyche, as a colonized psyche, experiences a type of cognitive dissonance that prevents it to anchor itself to the rich historicities that have defined its past. When it attempts to engage its rich past, it simply encounters a manufactured past that is not authentically its own, but that is imposed upon it by the intrusive outsider. In this case, it is the colonizing agents. This is because the colonial enterprise is a memory enterprise, and that colonialism, among other among other things, is an attempt at wiping out a people's memory. The uncritical engagement with the colonial heritage by African intellectuals, as noted by Edward W. Said, reproduces the pattern of an earlier imperialist history, one that instantiates forgetfulness of Africa's rich heritage, while validating an anemic linear past that grounds history at the feet of the colonizers as they entered the geopolitical world that is called Africa. In fact, Europe continues to embrace a consciousness of forgetfulness as it pertains to its colonial past and human rights abuses its colonial powers perpetuated in its colonies, many of which were in Africa. A healthy memory, collective or individual, is the locus of the repository of identity, a site of resistance, and a tool for healing. Following Humperdinck's trend of thought, I intend to shed light on how the fragmentation of memory of self, in this context, self is in the collective to mean people, perpetuates itself in the so-called post-colonial socio-political reality called Africa. To do this effectively, I intend to articulate clearly the defining markers of coloniality of imagination, that of itself produces an anemic sense of self and the validation of colonial oppressive structures, even when the initial producers of colonial exploitation are no longer present physically. And I quote, "Coloniality of imagination operates with the assumption that non-whites are incapable of possessing epistemic freedom because they are creatures without a history, without a civilization, without the corrective cognitive abilities to ask questions that lead to liberation," unquote. I'm quoting myself here. In fact, in my work in the past years, I have been trying to ask the question, what is happening to Africa? Why is Africa where it is today? And I started studying, taking seriously decolonial studies that explores the different colonialities. And in my own conclusion, what was really present there, the ability for the other three colonialities, coloniality of power, coloniality of being, and coloniality of knowledge to continue to perpetuate themselves in colonized societies is because of the vestiges and the presence of coloniality of imagination. So I concluded that no coloniality can ever function unless the imagination of a people has been held captive. And colonialism did that perfectly well. So furthermore, I also intend to offer some concrete approaches to overcoming coloniality of imagination in a manner that allows for a decolonial memory of surplus. By embracing the memory of surplus, I argue that an approach to African sense of agency ought to be the norm in order to foster a culture and praxis of wholeness. Now, the next section of my presentation I have titled Colonialism and an Anemia of Anthropological Consciousness in Post-Colonial Africa. We currently live in a world where systems reproduce themselves as though it is a robotic matrix of self-perpetuation. Economic systems are intended to reproduce themselves in such a manner that they constantly benefit those whose interests shaped the working mechanisms of such systems. While the Western world boasts of having in place global systems that are grounded in fairness and equity, the actual outcomes tell a different story. The structures of valuation and what is even considered good and services are determined by the so-called global north, economically advanced countries. And so we already see how even the COVID realities a few years ago showed our world that there were different valuations given to the human person. The West was busy hoarding medications while the rest of the world had no access to these medications. So reading the above, there's a report that was given about this hoarding of stuff that were almost in the trillions of dollars of how the West has continued to exploit the global South. So reading the above report closely, one is forced to ask the question, what has changed for the global South since the end of direct colonial rule by some Western nations? At the heart of colonialism is the desire to make the colonized sources of exploitation by the colonizer. So the colonizer commodifies the colonized and the world that the colonized inhabits in a manner that the process and outcomes always benefit the interests of the colonizer. It does not even end there. The images that are evoked by language serve the agenda of exploitation. To speak of the West or of the global North is to bring to being a deformed otherness that is neither West nor global North. Hence, that which is not of equal dignity as the West or the global North becomes a legitimized target of exploitation and manipulation. So I'm even arguing that even when we talk about West, whose West are we talking about? It's a politically laden identity marker. As Walter Mignolo will argue, and I quote him, the colonization of the Americas in the 16th and the 17th centuries and of Africa and Asia in the 19th and the early 20th centuries consolidated an idea of the West, a geopolitical image that exhibits chronological movement. So Mignolo makes some salient points that are worth exploring further. First, to conceive of the colonizer as the West is to bring to birth a type of historicity that effectively erases other histories. In fact, there is no history outside of that constructed by the narrative that makes present the vision of the West. So hence, Mignolo concludes the following. My story begins then with the emergence of the modern colonial world and of the modernity/coloniality, as well as with the assumption that cosmopolitan narratives have been performed from the perspective of modernity. Africa, in the imagination of the West, can also be referred to as coming to existence only with the historical consciousness produced by Western modernity. So what I'm trying to say in reading Mignolo closely is that Africa has no history because this history is given to it by the colonial powers. Though you should know that I'm being cynical here, so I'm not trying to say that I uphold that narrative, but I'm saying that that's the narrative that comes out from the world of colonialism. So in fact, the name Africa is a contested identity. Who is an African? Do we ascribe African identity to the Dutch Afrikaners in Southern Africa? Do we give that identity to Africans who were sold into slavery, both through the trans-Sahara slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and so on? A few years ago, I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I had an awakening experience. I saw some black people, and throughout the time I was there, I was the only black person that I was seeing around. Then I eventually saw some of them when we were visiting some castles. So I thought they were Americans. In my naiveness, I spoke English to them. They were looking at me. I spoke a little French I knew. They were looking at me. I spoke the Spanish I knew. They were looking at me. I said, "Word on net. What's going on? Where are you from?" They said, "From here." I'm like, "This is the Balkans. How can you come from here?" It didn't dawn on me that these are the descendants of the Trans-Nile, Trans-Mediterranean, and Trans-Saharan slave trade. So do we ascribe African identity to them? We have to problematize that label because the term Africa, as it has been conceived and reimagined in the colonial world, it's supposed to be erasing and literally fracturizing identities. So if we are to really be whole, I am saying that even our identity as Africans has to be decolonized so that our mental framework can produce holistic imagination of what it means to be an African, a more inclusive African identity. So that said, my choice of a richer understanding of who can claim the identity African is conditioned by the fact that what colonized Africa has lost due to the systematic erasure of its rich historical past by colonialism can be retrieved through the memories of its diasporic siblings sold into slavery or who migrated to other parts of the world and retained a nostalgic consciousness of the ways of their people back in their respective ethnic groups and communities in Africa. And this is a project, and I want to say this quickly as well. This is a project I'm greatly invested in because as I continue to work on a big project of trying to articulate a pastoral theology that the African bishops, Catholic bishops, can use in their pastoral engagement with the queer people in Africa, the continent, I've come to the realization that most African knowledge, post-colonial knowledge of queerness, is really produced within the colonial context. Pre-colonial queer knowledge has been lost, or most of it has been lost, but a few of those knowledge reside in religious rituals of initiation. If you study African indigenous religions carefully, you will see queerness being expressed there because it's a religious cosmological worldview. But where do you find it fully expressed is in the diasporic religions. In North America and Latin America, I have found this there. So I'm really curious about, okay, what if this is just an aspect of lost memory? What else did we lose that we can retrieve from our diasporic communities outside of the continent? So this is because memory plays a crucial role in shaping Black diasporic identities. So the diasporic communities have the nostalgia, so they hold on to memories, especially memories they had before some of them were forcefully removed from the continent into slavery. So it serves as a link between past experiences and present realities, connecting individuals to their ancestral heritage and collective histories. For example, in African and Caribbean literature, memory is often portrayed as repository of cultural knowledge, sustaining traditions even as they evolve within new contexts. Memory in this context is not just about preserving the past, but also about reimagining it in ways that affirm cultural hybridity and resilience. So again, there is a historical whitewashing of collective histories to account for an ethic of superiority that is always in opposition to the histories of those whom the West has otherized. In this case, it is those who have been colonized. It is important that the colonizer upholds itself as embodying a superior ethics of being because such a justification allows it to carry out its grand agenda of exploitation and the strategic ordering of those it has set its gaze upon for exploitation. This ordering of the other and the embrace of the idea that the West embodies an ethic of superiority brings about all forms of privilege. Such privilege has economic, legal, normative, social, symbolic, and psychological ramifications. It determines who is hired and fired and into what positions, who governs the system of labor, and who benefits from that labor. It shapes the law and administrative structures so that they advantage some to the detriment of others. And in fact, this privilege can be argued to be the foundational principle that has defined the post-colonial state. As Achille Mbembe has argued, post-colonial nations and the states produce necropolitics. They are supposed to produce debt, and they are functioning very well, exactly how they ought to perform. And so when people complain that, oh, Africans is a failed continent with failed statehoods and all that, the argument, with the conclusion we have to reach is that that's exactly what it's meant to be. So you are supposed to be dazed with confusion, and while you are confused, you are being exploited, and then you're unable to ask the right question of why are we being exploited. So again, furthermore, if modernity is the matrix from which the ideation of an ethic of superiority emanates, by locating its origins within a geopolitical context, Northern Europe, a biased and hierarchized geography is legitimized. By this, I mean to speak of the world. It must necessarily be a world where Europe is the center. By proximity, other regions of the world derive their own legitimacy to exist and to claim their own civilizations. But such existence and civilizations can never derive their legitimacy in their own rights. They are subservient to that narrative that the center of the world, Northern Europe, produces. Again, in such a world, dualism reigns supreme. Whether in the domain of geopolitical or global economic systems, the production of dualistic images allows for the legitimization of a hierarchical consciousness that is needed for exploitation. This hierarchical consciousness is projected into the world of the otherized order to allow for a continuum of fracturization that defines the psyche of all that live in such a world. By a continuum of fracturization, I mean the constant fragmentation of all that constitute the world of the colonized. Frantz Fanon captures this point well when he writes, and I quote him, "From one day to the next, the blacks have had to deal with two systems of reference. Their metaphysics, or less pretentiously, their customs and the agencies to which they refer, were abolished because they were in contradiction with a new civilization that imposed its own," unquote. The new civilization has also produced a negation of both the collective and the individual bodies of Africans. Hence, the image of one's body is solely negating. It is an image in the third person. All around the body reigns an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. Now, in my work, I'm also, in part of another project I'm working on, I explore the sacramentality of Black bodies globally. I am arguing that the world we live in right now is a world where Black bodies, just for being Black, are meant to be fragmented bodies. And I'm not the only person who has said this. Du Bois, in the early 20th century, articulated this very well when he talked about the double consciousness that affects the African Americans. But I am also upending that narrative, using a decolonial lens to say that Christ, the incarnation, is God intentionally embracing fragmentation of bodies in solidarity with Black fragmented bodies. And that if we, through the Christian imagination, are to take seriously our Christian vocation, then the incarnation is where the fragmented body is where the healing of the sources and the structures and systems that fragment those bodies can find this, can be retrieved. So only through Black bodies that have been fragmented in history can the salvific grace of wholeness, empathy, and awakening to one's moral obligation be achieved. So the Black bodies are supposed to disrupt the imagination of the bodies that the systems that produce fragmentation. For example, let me give you a very concrete psychological example. Why did the Western world currently wake up to the genocide going on in Palestine? For goodness sake, for decades, Palestinians have been killed on a daily basis. There have been violence affecting also the Israelis as well. But why did the world wake up? It's because the world saw starving children. There is a way the suffering body of the innocent can get to a level where it awakens in somebody the moral consciousness, the moral obligation to say, we cannot go further. That does not mean that all the perpetuators will awaken, but some do awaken. And that's where I'm going to say, that's where I'm anchoring myself, that there is this grace of awakening, this resilient grace of God insisting that the fragmented body can be a body that mediates grace of wholeness for all. But I am not trying to ritualize the celebration of suffering. What I'm trying to say is that that is where the pathway of ending the suffering begins. So a false notion of relationality is produced by colonialism. Mutual dependency that is supposed to benefit all parties becomes a mirage, and one-sided relationship is upheld. The so-called direct colonial rule has ended in Africa. However, exploitation of Africa continues to be the norm. To shed more light on this continuum of fracturization that defines contemporary Africa, I turn to a psychologist, Hussein A. Bulhan, who introduced the concept of meta-colonialism to explain what is currently playing itself out in Africa. In his words, a successor of culmination of earlier forms of colonialism, meta-colonialism, likewise, serves Euro-American material exploitation, cultural domination, and psychological self-aggrandizement. These motifs persist by inertia of history, residual social and political structures of domination, and collective socialization through effective media and schools. Metacolonialism added to these factors its potent methods, conditioned mass passion for consumer goods imported from abroad, and an effective dissemination of the belief that this stage of colonialism, which is globalization, represents a great advance in human history. What therefore changed are not the motives, but the methods and tactics of satisfying those motives. What Bullman calls it inertia of history is actually colonial imagination, coloniality of imagination. This form of coloniality perpetuates itself by holding captive the collective memories of those being colonized or exploited. It is worth noting that the coloniality of imagination is not about an action itself. Rather, it is more about the rationale or logic behind an act or omission. It deals more with the horizon of meaning making that defines modes of behaving for a person or a group of people as social beings whose meaning making processes are defined by the many factors shaping their social world. The French word imaginaire, though not synonymous to the English word imagination, and yet very close to it, refers to the entire constellation of beliefs, patterns of thoughts, or the inner drive that motivates one's social behavior. So consequently, with this in mind, in this work, I am more inclined to an understanding of imagination that reflects the content of the French word imaginaire, because of the focus on coloniality of imagination, which affects all that imaginaire is all about. Thus, for coloniality of imagination to take hold, colonialism or imperialistic exploitation operates in a systematic manner in ways that the cultural markers of identity construction, worldviews, language, religion, and all other forms of meaning making are delegitimized and fractured, so that their feigned insignificance is itself moralized into the binary matrix of good and evil. As Valentin Dedji notes, and while reading closely the works of the Congolese theologian Karl Manin, coloniality of imagination in this case, in the context of Africa, produces what I would refer to call modes of alienation. In fact, the alienation that permeated African life was and still is to a large degree the result of an obsolete discourse that masked the contemporary Africa's estrangement from the vital sources of authentic development. Thus, colonized Africans, as victims of coloniality of imagination, though an uncritical acceptance of religion and law, end up existing within the peripheries of the world that has been created to replace the former world where they once were located. Hence, the religion allowed to operate in the new world created by the agents of colonialism and imperialism, and which has been accepted by Africans without asking the question, how do we rethink this religious heritage to allow it to speak to our own context? Has a particular vision of how to be authentically human. Such humanity must bow before the throne of such a religion and its own symbols of the divine. Fidelity to the tenets of such a religion is itself the passport to full humanity in such a world. On the secular side, the legal code serves as the rule for behavior in the spaces the law has deemed to be secular. By creating dualistic spaces of existence, the colonized body is encoded with rituals that perpetuate split existence. Each time such bodies enter into either the sacred or the secular space, they lose existential wholeness and simply become fractured bodies. Thus, wholeness becomes an elusive reality, one that can only be dreamed of but never experienced existentially. So I was once a missionary, and so I'm talking from something that I saw every day of the time I was in that world. And I'm also a theologian, so I'm also I'm an invested, guilty participant in this tragedy that has affected Africa. And I call it a tragedy in the sense that not because I'm against Christianity or Islam. No. I call it a tragedy because we, the religious voices and agents in Africa, have not done the needed work. To not just to, when people talk about enculturation, it's still a very surface level, and they usually think about putting on African garments, dancing to African music, but while still singing and saying the mass in Latin. That's not the point, or saying it in English. I am saying that Christianity must be taught through the African organic worldview, an African consciousness of thinking about Christianity. So until we start doing that and using symbols that are not just surface level symbols, but endemic to our African imagination, cultural imagination, to talk about God, we are still creating a Christianity that creates a split in the African body. So furthermore, the purpose of colonialism is to produce in the psyche of the colonized existential distractions. By this, I mean a way of living that never allows for the colonized to ask liberating questions and to pursue such questions to their logical conclusions, especially where the answers lead to their own liberation. Such liberating questions comprise the following: what has happened to us since our encounters with the colonial systems? Who have we become? How do we address the pathologies and traumas that colonialism has brought upon us? Existential distractions create a false sense of meaning and reality in the psyches of the colonized. So let me give you a very concrete example on this. Africa prides itself to say we celebrate Ubuntu, we value life, African consciousness, community, communalism, and so on. But genocide occurred in Rwanda recently and Burundi. Genocide is occurring in Congo, DRC, as I speak to you right now. And who are the people perpetuating this? Yes, people may say they are external agents who are beating the drum, but it's Africans using machete to kill fellow Africans. Exploitation of resources in Africa. Billionaires or African billionaires, most of them have no credible job exploiting the resources of their people. A few years ago, I was in Nigeria. The pension board, the head of the pension board, one person stole hundreds of millions of dollars, money that could have been used, that was supposed to use to pay pensioners, seniors, citizens of the nation. One person stole all of them, put the money, sock away pit, and then buried this wealth there so that he can enjoy the wealth alone. So the question is, are we even probing the narrative, language, the meaning we give to words, Ubuntu? There's no referential point or a reality that we can point to say this is how we are practicing our Ubuntu. The continent is in crisis, and so people are revolting not because they want a system that can operate. Most of them are revolting because they want their own siblings to have access, a key to the door of exploitation, so that they can have also part of the wealth. This is the crisis, that language, memory, discourse, reality are in dissonance. They are not in agreement in the continent. Scarcity is the preferential option of colonialism. In other words, the driving force behind colonialism that allows it to legitimize itself is to create a worldview that legitimizes scarcity. In the domain of religion, scarcity of divine encounters is enshrined within the theological understanding of how God operates in the world outside of the religious traditions upheld by the colonizer. We see this today as the crisis, the epidemic that Africa faces, this problem of religious imagination. The dominant religions, Islam and Christianity, cannot make room for other religious imaginations. And African indigenous religions that is more open-minded, welcoming, has been put to the peripheries by state power, not just the religious power. And so these two Abrahamic religions that are universalistic and do not yet know how to share space are now the ones pulling the African religious psyche back and forth and creating these modes of violence in the continent. So scarcity as colonial production is at the heart of the fractured memory that colonialism produces in the psyche of the colonized. What Africans remember and the realities from which they draw the content of their memories do not always align perfectly. The chasm that exists is itself a production and a continuum of coloniality of imagination. Memory is the bank of history. However, when memory is hijacked, history becomes alien to those who recall or tell their stories. What Africa remembers of its past must always be critiqued, else its content will constantly perpetuate the agenda of those who craft the hijacking of Africa's collective memory. Now, I also want to say something about Africa as a space. The nation states in Africa are geopolitical spaces and places. As you and I know, or may I remind all of us again, that spaces and places are never neutral. They are always charged with political agendas and narratives. And so the nation state as a place and space that is politically charged in post-colonial Africa has the vestiges of the agenda of the colonial logic. It is no surprising that the ethnic wars we are seeing today in Africa over boundaries are a result of this political matrix playing out in spaces and places in the continent. So I am also arguing in other works of mine that if Africa wants to embrace holistic decolonial thinking, we must probe the political matrices that are coded into the spaces and places that Africans call home. That said, before you think that I have become a prophet of doom, let me transition to solutions. So this other part of my presentation I have titled Towards a Theo-Decolonial Memory of Surplus for a New Africa. I call it a theo-decolonial because I'm a theologian at the core of my imagination. So I want to talk from my own discipline, but while being very decolonially conscious through in my narrative. So a theo-decolonial memory of surplus is a deliberate turn to a polyphony of memory and an embrace of strategic alliances that refuse to validate the false duality that the scarce imagination inherent in colonialism produces. It means a deliberate claim of Africa's theological consciousness and praxis of speaking of the God of life who has incarnated God's self within the fabric of Africa's cultural worldview. In doing this, it means taking seriously the impact of colonialism on Africa's collective psyche. It validates the claim that Africans must tell their own stories as stories of disruption that awaken the psyche of Europe and all its agents of exploitation in Africa and of Africans themselves to the full consequences of their acts and omissions of exploitation of the African people and their resources, to allow for change of course and an embrace of authentic solidarity with Africans as they rebuild their world. Chama J. Kaunda notes this well when he writes, and I quote him, African theology on decolonial thinking argues that the process of geographical decolonization did not put into consideration the extent to which Africans had internalized oppression and lost sight of indigenous agency. The latter led in turn to recolonization of the self by Africans, unquote. Unpacking further this motif of theo-decolonial memory of surplus, Kaunda argues that theo-decoloniality as African theological paradigm is a struggle to unmask the manifestation of Africa's own self-recolonizing thought system disguised as a legitimate way of knowing, acting, and knowledge production in Africa. An uncontested way of meaning-making and interpretation of reality. It challenges the dominant assumption that Euro-American is the only epistemic site from which Africans should define, describe, conceptualize, and rank themselves. It calls for a theological knowledge that redefines and redescribes the reality from the cosmologies and epistemologies of the subalterns. The subalterns are people located on the margins or the oppressed and exploited side of post-colonial, neo-colonial difference. Decolonial thought inaugurates a new thinking about theological strategies and tactics for mind decolonization in Africa. It is an other thought that seeks to inaugurate an other logic, an other language, and other thinking that has the potential to liberate ex-colonized people's minds from colonial, neo-colonial, self-recolonizing thought system. The theo-decolonial turn is the opening and the freedom from the thinking and the forms of living, economics order, political theories order, the cleansing of the coloniality of being and of knowledge, the delinking from the spell of the rhetoric of modernity from its imperial imaginary articulated in the rhetoric of democracy. Now, the power of a decolonial theological consciousness resides in its ability to start its own narrative. Because, as we all know, the logic of colonialism produces a pathway of its own monologue that it calls dialogue. I might dabble into unknown waters by making the following statement, and I say it with humility. The critique of post-colonial thinking is that it still operates within the logic of colonial thought. And if the one who builds that road, that logical framework, will always win that logic. And so how do you ensure that you are not dancing the dance of the oppressor, and you think that you are pushing the oppressor away? You have to embrace a decolonial consciousness. So, however, any retrieval of the past ought to also be in dialogue with contemporary allies of Africa who are in other parts of the world and who seek to also undo the structures of imperialism. I am arguing that a decolonial consciousness calls for allyship. It calls for transboundary allyship. A friend of mine, a German biblical scholar, Susan Scholz, once challenged me when we were talking some years back, and I told her she did not know that German colonial era, Germany had a colonial history. She just thought they were not there because she said they were not taught in their schools. I was like, that's the European guilt, unfortunately, where the reduction of history has become the curriculum. And so eventually I told her how Germany colonized parts of Africa, and even a strip of Nigeria, the middle belt of Nigeria, was a German territory until after the First World War they moved out, and some of those parts were given to the French. And in Nigeria, the French gave that part to the British, and the British gave, I think, parts of Niger or Chad to the French. So that said, she now told me, she said, Simon, there are also barbarians in the global north. We have barbarians. Barbarians, I'm using barbarian as a motif here, that the barbarians of the global north are also the deprived ones. They seek a longing of freedom. In the United States, we have barbarians also. They are, and I hope you know that I'm using this word in a positive way, that the African Americans in a racialized society are the barbarians of North America, the English-speaking North America. First Nation people of Canada and the Native Americans of the United States are the barbarians of here. Latinos, black and brown bodies in Trump's America are the barbarians of the United States currently. LGBTQ plus persons are the barbarians also of hyper-religious societies around the world. And exploiters are also present in the global south. Just as you have barbarians in the global north, you have colonizers and their allies in the global south. And so a decolonial engagement must figure out how to build bridges of encounter and solidarity between the barbarians of the global south and the barbarians of the global north to address the exploitations that are playing out globally. So that said, the theo-decolonial turn is not intended to proselytize. Rather, it is to say that in a world where a monopoly of secularism has been elevated to be the standard, a turn to the divine has also a legitimate claim to the heart of humanity and can also offer concrete ways of bettering the human condition. Also, it is to argue for an ethics of life that is grounded in a religious worldview that preferences an altruistic love of the other as one's neighbor. A decolonial turn that can birth forth memories of surplus for the citizens of the colonized world must necessarily embody the practice of the retrieval of historical memories as a form of painting. Why painting, you may wonder? Encountering painting offers the possibility of knowing and unknowing. I am intentionally arguing for aesthetics. That aesthetics has a way of healing the psyche, collective psyche of a people. It also has a way of awakening us. It has a way of sparking a polyphonic discourse, a polyphonic retrieval of meaning, which prose may not always be able to do. So the painter paints, but the viewer who encounters the painting is drawn into a world of knowing and unknowing. The viewer sees the familiar, but the painting transcends the familiar. This transcendence offers the possibility for the painting to offer more possibilities and opportunities to derive new meanings through the rituals of encounter as proximity between the viewer and the painting itself. Also, this transcendence reveals itself within the ritual of encounter as translation. As Jacques Derrida notes, to encounter a painting is to attempt to translate it, but such translation opens up multiple pathways of awareness that never exhausts the painting itself. Why am I also advocating for painting? If you pay close attention to solutions, those of you who are in peace studies directly would notice that the West tends to be fixated on its own paradigm of peace building. But we have seen that sometimes that's just a cultural, contextual way of addressing conflict and may not be the right way of addressing conflict everywhere. The Rwanda and South Africa surprised the world when they did the Peace and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and the Gacaca courts of Rwanda, that there are different modes of peace building that can be appropriated by our world. And why this idea of difference, plurality of creative ways of peace building is also synonymous to retrieval of meaning when one encounters painting. So on the part of Africans themselves, Dembelt Nweg offers a pathway of escape from the captivity of exploitation and aridity of memory that colonial trauma produces in the continent. For Nweg, African art is a pathway of encounter with the rich African past and the possibility for reclaiming surplus memories of life and meaning that define the African worldview. It is also a decolonial response to colonial traumas of aridity of meaning and violence against all things that produce abundant life for all. In the process of using art as a decolonial tool for reclaiming Africa's rich memories, Africans must also be intentionally critical of anything in their heritage that has led to the diminishing of life for all. The cries of Africans women, those who have been reduced to the shadows of the caste system, must also be centered in the process. It is not just a turn to art that is the process of retrieval. Rather, it must be art that has the ability to disrupt systems of marginality and erasure to allow for an experience of abundant life for all. In fact, it is a direct response to the existential reality of anthropological poverty. For Nweg, anthropological poverty consists of despoiling human beings not only of what they have, but of everything that constitutes their being and essence, their identity, history, ethnic roots, language, culture, faith, creativity, dignity, pride, ambitions, right to speak. Through art, Nweg upends the majesty of colonial greed in the African cultural and religious space. In one of his artistic works, Nweg uses the motif of the majestic, crucified Christ and the matters of Uganda to speak back to colonial greed and the culture of elitism playing out in Africa today. As Matt's historian, a blogger, the blogger's name, I could barely pronounce it, noted this artwork of Umvegi. He reflects on the artwork of Umvegi, and I want to quote him or quote them. At the foot of Christ crucified stands the martyrs of Uganda. They are the image of all those people in Africa who have united the sacrifice of their lives to that of Christ crucified. The cross rises up out of a cosmic background, cruciform patterns, the 4 points of the compass, and sun and moon motifs, circles and crescents, and triangular and diamond shapes, symbols of fertility and life. The whole is in 3 fundamental colors: red, the color of life; black, the color of suffering; and white, the color of death. Thus, Africa, mankind or humankind, and the whole cosmos are evoked and comprised in the vast gesture of Christ on the cross. Father, into thy hands I commend my breath of life. But the splendor and majesty of this cross sings the paschal triumph of the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, you shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die, unquote. So I want to conclude by saying the following, because I don't want to read too much, because I would like to engage you in the Q&A. I have been also paying close attention. I left Nigeria in 2001 and came to the United States. And I've been paying, but before I left Nigeria, I noticed that from when I was a young boy in the 1980s to my youthful years in the 90s when I was in college, I noticed that there were a lot of liberation musicians who took social justice issues. Maria Makemba of South Africa, and so many of them that come to mind. They were singing for Africa's liberation. They were singing for the freedom of Namibia. They were singing for the end of apartheid. These were transcontinental allies. They were building transcontinental allyship through music, through the aesthetics. But one thing I have noticed of recent is that there's been a shift in music in many African countries. It's now become more of, I don't want to call it nonsensical. That's not what I want to say. It's more of just words and sound, and you are dancing and shaking your body, but there is no message. That prophetic message is not there. It's almost like there's now a complete shift. And now I'm arguing that maybe we need to be careful about that. We need to pay close attention. Why is that the case? Is it that the artists of Africa have lost their audience or the will to be prophetic? Is it that they have given up their prophetic agency because the society no longer knows how to engage or address the prophetic narrative? I don't know. Maybe some of you might be interested in that line of research. But I am arguing that if we do not engage the aesthetics as a way of disrupting our collective social imagination and awakening us to new ways of asking questions that are Africa's questions, we will always live as in colonized bodies. Our psyches have already been colonized, but there are pathways of disrupting that colonial matrix so that we can awaken to what has happened to us and we can begin to ask Africa's questions. And I think theology can do that within the context of Africa, not the theology of division, not an exclusivist theology, but an interfaith, transboundary, barbarian allyship type of theology. That's where it can be. And it must, first of all, deconstruct the systems from which the theology operates. I am doing that with you right now because I am a Catholic systematic theologian. But what did I just do? I went to the jugular of Christian Catholic theology to retrieve a new way of doing theology for Africa's liberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, SimonMary, for this wonderful and powerful presentation. And already I can see in chat, some people are asking for the presentation. And so if you could...
I sent it to you. Oh, should I put it? How do you do? Do I put it on? I can put it.
No problem. Then I will send it to them.
Yeah, send it. As I said, it is a chapter in a book of mine that is currently being reviewed for publication. So you can't cite it correctly because I might do some changes based on the reviewer's comments when the manuscript comes back to me. But you can read and disseminate as you see fit.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you. I can say, Janet, please, you're welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm what would you say, wowed by this magnus opus of your scope of thinking. And I have like three things to say. If I were to reduce it to one thing, all this vast array that you presented, I'd say it's a question of power over that suppresses, etc., and looking for ways to incorporate inclusion and etc., various perceptive, aesthetic, and theological things. Okay, one, it's very funny because I'm writing about the death of my mentor. And so that is a kind of colonization too, right? And so what you said is strikingly relevant. Okay, second, take the case of Jerusalem. I was struck when you said the big universal religions within a teeny space in old Jerusalem. It's amazing because there's the most important, very important Muslim mosque. There's the Jewish whatever, and there's the surprisingly no synagogue, and that I saw, and there's the Stations of the Cross, and we stayed in the Vatican hostel there, you know, with the huge picture of the Pope. So you just like reach out your arms, and there in one of the most militarized places I've ever been, you see all these defense forces walking around in groups with machine guns. So I think Jerusalem could be the model for this universalist acceptance of inclusion, but instead it's so divided, walled off, militarized, you know? Okay. And the third thing that I want to say, because I think it's really quite amazing what you're saying. But I think the power of art, you're also pointing to this the way of allowing for diverse interpretations. But when we engage in looking at art or making art, then, what happens to those diverse interpretations? How do they get snuffed out? And this relates quickly to the snuffed out memories, narratives, etc. So I don't know if that's exactly a question, but pick the part you want to.
No, I think I get.
Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome, Janet. I got some strands of what you are saying. Let me begin from the last part. Whose interpretation do we embrace as a community? There, I turn to Nietzsche. It is the will to power. Aesthetics also produces a type of competition. But the competition that we must, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that competition is bad. In fact, if you study my works very well, I try as much as possible to stay within the domain of beyond good and evil. So I am Nietzschean to the core. I do believe that when you start talking about this is good, this is bad, you lose the richness of the experience. So that said, it is the flourishing of all in the community that should be the background, the principle that defines the will to power, the competition. So if my interpretation wins the day, the question we should ask, the ethical question, does my interpretation create a wider circle of belonging? If your interpretation wins, the same question should be asked, does yours create a wider circle? If we bring both interpretations together and hold them in tension, will that create a wider circle? So this is the question we need to be asking, the question of abundant life for all. Now, let me give you a quick story, Janet. I was in Lumumba. I wrote this work for a conference. I was going, part of it, I began working on this project when I went to Lumumbashi in Congo, DRC, for a conference. And then the conference was about retrieval of Africa's arts. And as we were having these conversations, it started dawning on us that there were different points of views in the conversation. Some artists, some scholars were saying, why bring this artwork to Africa? The world by which these works were produced no longer exists. And they are more seen in France than if you bring it to Tanzania, that may be in a village and then maybe no one will see it again. And then some people now say, no, bring it back. Whether we put it under our bed or on our top of our TV, it is our own. It has something to speak to us. It is our heritage. Did we find a solution to that? The answer is no, but at least it sparked a conversation, which I took back to the United States and continued my research. But go ahead. And so then the next thing you said about Jerusalem, power operates. It's not surprising that one of the temptations Jesus Christ faced was the issue of power. Religion, in fact, then must be decolonized and delegitimized is in the domain of the mystical tradition. And all Islam has it, Christianity has it, Judaism has it, Hinduism has it. The mystics live at the peripheries. They upend the matrix of power. But what do these religions do? They push the mystics to the peripheries because they are afraid of the mystics. The mystics speak a different language. So I have argued that if we need a better world, we really need to live peripherally and turn to the mystical tradition. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, SimonMary. And I'm looking for questions in chat, but please feel free to raise your hand. This has been a wonderful presentation on reclaiming the African imagination. And
Okay.
yes, Evelyn, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. An amazing presentation. And my question is, in your own journey from colonial to decolonial theology, what were the key milestones? What were the stepping stones, the points of deep internal reckoning?
Oh my goodness, Evelyn. Well, is it the Holy Spirit that is sending you to come and disturb my peace this morning?
You said you needed waking up.
Yes. Oh my, I am laughing because I can laugh about it now. I'll tell you the story. In 2005, I was working in a parish in Los Angeles, studying for the priesthood for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And then the pastor asked me to put together an culturally diverse liturgy. So the parish is one of the largest parishes in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It has 13 to 15 masses on Sunday, and the church is packed full, each of the masses. And so this was, I think, our Thanksgiving celebration. So I put this liturgy stuff together. And then we had the flags. We have 68 countries represented in the parish community. So we had the flags of 68 countries surrounding the flag of the United States. And the Native American family held the flag and in procession, a sign of welcoming everyone, hospitality in the community, in this nation. So even though that's not our historical reality, but that's what we aspire for. Yeah, too. Now, I was in the white robe with the priest, and we are singing, processing into the church, and the priest taps me on the shoulder. Simon, I put the black Jesus on the altar so that you don't feel alone in the church. There are not very many black parishioners, but he was just joking with me. So I looked up at the altar, the sanctuary, and I saw the image of a black Jesus. That's the first time in my life I have seen Jesus painted as a black person. I was going to be ordained a deacon the next year. Do you know what came out from my mouth? And I did not know my microphone was on. I said, "That's not Jesus. Jesus is not black." The whole church that was singing heard me. The microphone was on, and they turned around and looked, and I was like, "Oh!" Everyone was looking at me. I wasn't embarrassed about that experience, but it awakened something in me. 19 years prior to that moment, I had been in formation. I was an Augustinian monk for a year, and then I was a diocesan, then I joined the Spirit. I was a missionary. I had trained people who were already priests. But not one moment did it dawn on me that I had embraced an aesthetics of the divine that did not include me, that did not include my black identity. That was the moment of awakening for me. So I remember that day, I did not have any Thanksgiving dinner. I went to my room, sat at the center of my living room in the parish house, and started crying. And I kept asking myself, how was I colonized? I thought I was Christianized, but I was colonized. What have I been reading? How have I been practicing this Christianity? That was when my own journey of awakening began. I started asking new questions that disrupted my own meta framework, my own thinking, made me most uncomfortable until eventually I became comfortable in my discomfort. So that's the Evelyn, that's this experience. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, SimonMary. I'll go to Richard. You're welcome. And then Eda.
Yes, and thank you so much. And good afternoon from Africa. I'm glad always what is put before us goes with the knowledge, not the physical aspect of it. I believe the oppressor is also being oppressed. It's also being oppressed. And then the oppressee is also oppressing someone. So it's our looks not ending. But let's say Africa, we talk about ours too much. The white, as Prof said, we have whites who are poor, even more than some of us are African, who are being oppressed more than we had back then. So therefore, forward. So I think it's. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you now.
So I think it's all with the mind. It's all you'll be oppressed a bit. The next hour, you'll be freed, and you also oppress someone. When your boss comes to the office and is angry, then it means he has been instructed somewhere harshly. So you need to share that difficulty with you at that particular time. So that is how I think it is. So Africans, we need not talk too much. Other than that, the Asians, the Westerns will be laughing at us more often. Thank you.
You're welcome. I do agree with you that we have oppressors that both suffer, and in fact, it's I'm working on a book manuscript right now which I talked about the sacramentality of black bodies. And in that work, I am arguing that the narrative in the West, especially in the United States, the way I live, of the black response to racial oppression cannot solve the problem, because it's still within the domain of a scarcity mindset that, oh, they've taken our wealth, they are taking this from us. So who is the new enemy? The white person is the enemy. I am arguing that if you look at Africa, that the African Americans need to take seriously with what happened in post-colonial Africa. The Africans drove away the Europeans, but nothing changed in the African psyche. Exploitation continued. It was now black bodies exploiting black bodies. But rather, Africa should have created a new narrative of inclusion. We never did that. And so, African American context, the narrative on race must not be linear conversation. It must be a concentric circle of life. Bring that the victims of the first bodies that are diminished are the white bodies, because we are relational creatures. If I say you will not relate with me, I go and put a wall demarcating you from me, I have made myself a prisoner without knowing. And so we need, in trying to free ourselves, we need to break down barriers and create a wider circle that is more inclusive. Maybe next, when that work comes out, I should be done this year. But it might be expensive, so who knows? We live in the capitalist world.
Thank you so much, Ada, and then Asese.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor SimonMary. Like everyone else, you touch my soul in a number of ways, and reminded me of things that I would like to have more clarity and better understanding in order for us to have a clear understanding of of what we do about how we define who is an African, and not necessarily defining but who we are as a people when we are challenged by all these challenges that we face. Thank you so much for going different ways to give us this very theoretical grounding that gets us to think about what we want to do. Two things. When you ask the question, who is an African? I am reminded of President Beki's question when he asked, who is an African? But then I even went further and remembered Wole Soyinka's famous quote, "A tiger does not proclaim his tigritude, he pounces." That in terms of African identity, what is that telling us? Who we are, how we describe ourselves to validate ourselves, or is it about what ought to be a focus on our actions and contributions to this reclaiming of who we are? So I would like you to just, bring that in, think about it. Also, last week but one, I was at a conference in Oslo, Norway, and I went into a session that was addressing the work of Martin Luther King and peace building. And the concept that I learned from that panel was about maladjustment. How Martin Luther King talked about maladjustment, which is really a metaphor of this moral imagination to take action. Someone else in the panel said, to better understand it, we can look at John Lewis' Good Trouble. So perhaps, Professor, you all this, and then today I learned about the barbarians in the West. And I just really appreciate all this. And maybe, you just tie all this theological and thing together. Finally, I want to share a story and personal. Is there a question about the African church? Do we need to rethink who we are, who the church is? Last week, I lost my young brother in Australia. He was found dead in his flat. And I am working on a program at our church back home so that we can celebrate his life. And I chose a song, beautiful song written by the Bee Gees. It's called Immortality. And the pastor told me, no, it is not gospel song. And wow, last week, the same church, and I'm not judging, the same church, a pastor was accused of sexual abuse of young boys. And in my view, goodness me, is our concern non-gospel songs being played in church? Or this other big thing of abuse? I leave it at that, but I've just been really theorizing this response that I got and getting me to where you are telling us, Professor, that and what we do in this forum, how we need to rethink how and open ourselves to plural thinking. Jesus is a moral concept. Jesus will not care whether you play Bee Gees or whatever, Tupac in church, so long as it's the message: justice, peace, care for others. Let me reach there. Help me understand this better. And when I go home, I hope I can have a conversation with the pastor who told me that in a good way and see where it goes, if it can happen. Thank you.
Should I speak, George?
Yes, please, you may respond to that, SimonMary,
Okay.
and then we'll ask Asese, and I saw somebody else, but we'll see.
Okay, Eda, thank you very much for sharing your story, and I am in solidarity with you as you mourn. I'm sorry to hear that. Let me say this quickly. Why do we celebrate funerals? It's because of memories. To remember, there is something about the sacramentality of memory. That's what why we even celebrate as in the Eucharist. Jesus Christ says, do this in memory of me, to remember. And why do we remember? To remember is to form community, to bring the fragmented bodies to wholeness, to I'm playing the pun of words here, remember, to bring the bodies together so that they can become a koinonia, a fellowship of life. Why are songs? Why do we sing songs during funeral? We sing songs that tie to the memory of this person. That song meant something to this person, or speaks about the life of the person. So I think the pastor was operating from a more narrow understanding of what a liturgical song should be. I'm not saying that all songs should be should be used, but does the song produce the koinonia, the fellowship of memory? Does it create bond among the people? Does it root us in the bond that Christ wants us to embrace? Does it make us ground us in our context so that we can be fully who we are called to be as people who are in fellowship with each other? if the yes to all this, then there's nothing wrong with that. So again, as I said, colonialism produces a fear to be creative, to be playful, because creativity resides in the domain of playfulness. But because colonialism produces a crisis, a psychological crisis in us, we become very scared of being playful. We become very rigid. We go by the book. And that's not how life is. That you don't build community by the book. You build community by being embodied, playful creatures who wander and laugh and encounter each other.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Hafiz, please, and then Laid.
Please go to the next person now. I'm in the United places. The next one is thank you.
Hafiz, we can barely hear you. Please go ahead.
Go to the next person.
Oh, you said you can call the next person.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I see. Laid, please. Hafiz, in the meantime, you may put your question in chat or comment, please. Laid? Laid, if you hear me. Well, maybe let me also ask a question about, you mentioned Nyerere, having, a better idea really about,
Yes, can I speak?
colonial trauma.
Excuse me. Can I speak, George?
Yes,
hear
you
me?
can, Laid.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the speaker. That was very interesting. Well, it is interesting, actually. I just want to remind us the contribution of the writer Frantz Fanon to the Algerian Revolution. He gave international dimension of that revolution, and of course he shed light on the contribution of Algerian people to decolonize the country. That's nobody can deny. And right now, if we cannot transfer what happened during the revolution between Algeria and France, right now the relation between the two countries are very bad. Why? Because of the willingness of the Algerian authorities to secure their independence, their dignity. Toward Motor Street N5. Hello? Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm telling you, today I can understand why some of French people are opposed to the Algerian recovering of its dignity and its independence. They don't want to see Algeria emerged as a self-building country, I would say independent one, sovereign one. And we have a lot of negative attitude from some of the French society against this. But on the other hand, also I come across about 3 weeks ago of the literature of Ngugi, and equally I was amazed that we have in Algeria the same author called Malik Ben Nabi, who used the term of colonizability, which means some person won't be independent. They still want to be under colonization. So the whole process of decolonization may take many years, if not decades, because some people get accustomed to colonial mentality. But frankly speaking, Algeria, and through Algeria, Africa is embarked on decolonization process. And of course, though there are a lot of, I will say, constraint and limitation, but the continent has embarked on the process of recovering its dignity and its independence. And we cannot forget that African Union, through the African Union, they have adopted the Agenda 2063, which aims to recover for safer continent, prosper continent, and dignified continent.
Thank you
Thank you so much. Hafiz, let's take two questions or comments, one from Hafiz, another one from Mwalimu Kibiswa, and then you may respond to them together, Simon and Mary. Hafiz, please. Hafiz, maybe that's an old hand. Let's go to Naupes Kibiswa, please. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, George. And really, I regret I missed the whole or the big part of the conversation with SimonMary, who is a wonderful teacher and philosopher. So this is my take, and I will repeat this as long as we are dealing with the issue between Congo and Rwanda. Most of the time when we speak about decolonization, we only see white people who came to colonize Africa. But I need you to take a conscience and I'm trying to find the words, to look at what is happening between Rwanda and the DRC. You may think it's about natural resources, but you might remember what President Kagame said when he was, I don't remember this, at two places, at two different places. One, he said something in Benin, in Cotonou, and the other one, he said, I don't remember which place. The first one, when he was at Benin, he said, what is happening in the Congo, it's not a problem of M23. It is the problem of our territories that have been taken by Belgians, and that's what's the problem, because we have people of Rwandan heritage who are part of the Congo today, and they feel better with us than with Congolese. That last part, I am the one who added. But he says there are people of a Rwandan heritage, Rwandan ethnicity, who are in Congo, meaning we are going to take them to be part of us. So, and he is repeating something President, the first post-genocide Rwanda's president, Pastor Bizimungu, said, all these territory you see there, he was from Shangugu, and he was showing South Kivu. All these territories you see there are territories that belonged to the Kingdom of Rwanda. So now, when you take the history of Rwanda, the way Tutsi became kings in Rwanda, because they came in with that spirit of colonizing others. And today we still have the government of Rwanda with 80% of political position held by Tutsi. 80% held by Tutsi. That the same thing that is bringing them to Congo. If you come now to Congo, the army what we call Army of the Congo, the FARDC, is controlled by Rwanda and Rwandans who have been, who came to Congo with Laurent Kabila and was put in place by Joseph Kabila all along the borders between Congo and Rwanda. And those are people who are doing everything. So when you say decolonizing everything, I'm trying, and when you hear President Kagame, he said, and that's what I didn't want to forget. He said, natural resources, but you are accusing us without accusing those who are beneficiaries of natural resources. Resources from Congo pass through Rwanda. So we are only a transit, only transit. Our interest in Congo is territory, but it's not only territory, it's also domination. We want to dominate people there. So I would like to question our process of decolonization, or our idea of decolonizing, sorry for my accent. So how can we conciliate this with, I thought we are talking against those who came to colonize Africa, but we have also colonizers among us. And they say they are Pan-Africanists. So how can I, Congolese, believe in Pan-Africanism when I see one of the leaders of Africa who claim to be Pan-Africanist, and namely Kagame, and you're talking to me about decolonizing with people like that? Just a comment, and I'd like you to, I'm not protecting the whites, no. I'm not whitewashing what they did, no. I'm saying we need to be wise enough to see among the white you have people who disagree with that mentality. But among the black, we have those who embrace that mentality and want to use it. When you hear Kagame, he will say, oh, it's colonization, it's colonizers, it's Belgians, it's because of them. No, it's because of you, Mr. President Kagame, not because of them. It's because your ethnic groups, your mindset is a colonizing mindset. And that colonizing mindset hurts Hutu, who are the majority. And because of that, that hatred became the genocide ideology you share with them, and then you fight most of the time in your country, and you send your fight spill over the Congo, and then we are suffering, we are paying more than Rwandans what happened in 1994 in Rwanda. So that's my comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was quite insightful. I would like now to ask SimonMary to respond, but also to use this opportunity to wrap up. We'd like really to thank you so much indeed for your presentation. And we thank everybody also here on board. We look forward to seeing you next week. Asese, it seems you have a point, yes. Right?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you for the presentation, Simon, and all those people that have been contributing since. So what I would like to us to point that since ever that we have been discussing colonization, decolonization, post-colonization that we have been discussing, when Simon was presenting, talking about the aesthetics to correct the issue of colonization, it comes to my mind, have we ever questioned how Africa come to the stage to be colonized? In a single word, can we think about pre-colonization? And I think the question of who Africa is can actually answer the question, but we are not actually directly it. So why did Africa colonized? What is the reason behind our colonization? Because if you go to the root cause, I think that one will open up what may likely be the solution to the issue of colonization. Because the colonizations have been discussed for like many decades now. So do we ever think of, is it because we are too hospitalized that we are colonized, or we are not intelligent as they claimed? So I think we should go back to the root cause, that who is Africa? And the question of who is Africa is to answer why did Africa colonized? What was the reason? That is it because we are so lenient that you cannot see the even trends in those people that are coming like a friend, and at the end of the day try to dominate us, try to control our mind? So this is what I'm trying to put into the consideration of the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And maybe as you wind up, SimonMary, if you could also touch upon just briefly about Nyerere, you know, something you said about Nyerere, that would be quite interesting. So thank you so much also for your patience. And today we've got the patient man with us here, SimonMary.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. Let me begin. The last two questions are similar, and I will answer it by telling you quickly a quick story. When I was doing my dissertation research, I went back to my village where my father and my mother come from to study that village, town. Because I wanted to study, I wanted to know why is it that in Nigeria, many communities, religious groups are fighting each other, Islam and Christianity. But in the place where I come from, it's almost divided 30% equally. Christians 30%, Muslims 30%, indigenous religion is 30%. And there has never been any war of religion in my town. So I was doing ethnographic work to understand what's really going on. Then I found out that the power of their religious imagination was grounded in their indigenous religions, and they said that in their indigenous religions, to take another person's life is to go against everything that they stand for. So this had shaped their Christian imagination and Islamic imagination, which was quite telling. But that said, I came to one of the neighboring villages or town in the place I come from. It's called Iviaro, which means the children of Aro. And Aro, Nduziogu, are Igbos. They were itinerary priests who went around all over Western Africa and Central Africa selling their trade of divinization and all that stuff. So, and then I started studying my own mother tongue and realized that because I also know Igbo language, I spent some time in Igbo land, Eastern Nigeria, and I realized that we had appropriated words from Igbo language. But it was when I now said, Iviaro means children of Aro. Aro people are not traditionally from my place, but they are now one of us. Now, where am I going with this? I want to push back at Naupe's comment. I want to tell Naupes as well that I still see vestiges of a colonial thinking in your imagination, which I want to unpack with you. That said, pre-colonial Africa, John Reader wrote a book, Africa, the Making of a Continent. And in that book, he was talking about how the West used tribal consciousness to perpetuate colonial rule. And that also addresses Asese's question. So pre-colonial Africa, tribal identity was fluid. It was not a rigidified, static, concrete way of identity markers. You could belong and not belong. You could be welcomed in. But colonial process put everyone in tribal categories and became rigidified, codified. So you couldn't leave your tribe. So even here today, the Aro people cannot be called Iviaro and be part of my tribe, my community, my people. They will be considered outsiders. But in the past, pre-colonial time, they were not considered outsiders. They became part of the community. And they created a home, and they became part of the ruling class of the nation. Now, let me say something to now, Pes. What is Congo? What is Rwanda? These are colonial verbiages and that's why I talked earlier on that we need to reimagine the politics of spaces and places that we now live in the post-colonial realities of the nation state in Africa. So when you say that, in fact, in part of my work, I did not mention this because I just felt I will address it during the Q&A. I have argued, and I'm also arguing, that not everything in Africa's pre-colonial past can be retrieved. Some of them need to be suppressed. Caste system, for example, is unhealthy. I cannot find a justification for that. We have caste systems in Western Africa. I don't know of other parts. So
in Rwanda too.
Yeah, okay. So land expansion. What is Rwanda? It's really nothing. It's a colonial reality. So we have become police officers of a colonial matrix, a colonial logic. That is what the nation state is. I encourage all of you to read the work of Achille Mbembe and Necropolitics, and you will see how the African state is meant to produce this fragmentation, violence, grabbing of land, perpetuation and continuity of the colonial logic. And it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Kagame is technically one of the colonizers of within the continent. So there's internal colonialism occurring, there's external colonialism occurring, but it's still within this logic, this matrix of colonial logic. Now, why is the internal one working? It is working effectively because there is no counter narrative strong enough to dilute it. Why? Because all of us have become victims of the colonial logic and the colonial matrix. And so because we have become victims, we are still operating within the matrix of the logic of colonialism. My land, your land, still a divisive narrative. We need to upend that and start a new conversation. Do you need land to flourish if you are a Rwandese in Congo? Then this land is for you. Like where I come from in my own town, my tribe, we don't sell land even till today. That is something we still held on to that is pre-colonial. Land is not our property to sell. You need a land to build a home. They give you the land to build a home. The land belongs to the community. Yeah, it's crazy, not so? Yeah, but it's still working.
And so tomorrow he will say, this is my origin. And he
nothing wrong. The notion of origin is still a colonial matrix way of
I'm sorry, that's what Rwandans are doing in Congo.
It's a human being who needs to eat, who needs to flourish. So I've been to your country. It's a lovely country. It's a large country. I loved it. Lubumbashi, I was there. So, and I saw the colonial thing, the exploitation of your resources. But I would say that all of us in Africa must question our logic of thinking of how we construct identities, or else we'll fall back into the colonial matrix. Now, George, you said something about, could you say what you wanted to say something about?
Well, I think also in the interest of time, we can read Nyerere and his ideas on decolonization and the colonial trauma. So I thank you very much for your patience. I thank you so much, our speaker, SimonMary, and everybody. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your interest in global peace studies for sustainable development in Africa. See you next Wednesday. Bye-bye for now.
See you now. Thanks again.